Slavery has been called the United States' original sin. One of the most dramatic features of this sordid history was the attempt to prevent slaves from escaping their captivity. Thus, the so-called Underground Railroad was created. But the question about Ripon, Wisconsin's specific role in the Underground Railroad is now, and maybe always will be, up for debate. The story begins on a national level more than 3 centuries ago, when South Carolina adopted its first act to prevent runaways, as early as 1683. 100 years later, Georgia established a nightly slave patrol in its main port city of Savannah. Shortly before the American Revolution, Southern colony officials favored draining wetlands to prevent deserting slaves and wild beasts from finding shelter in the swamps. At the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the problem of runaway slaves posed a serious threat to the creation of the new nation. If a durable union were to be forged between the southern slave states and the northern anti-slavery states, slaves running for freedom would have to be stopped. The new Constitution included a statement that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due.
You know, you can even go back to the writing of the Constitution, because there was, almost from the beginning, there was this conflict between the slave states and free states. And a lot of it had to do with who's going to control the government. So if you look at the writing of the Constitution, one of the provisions right in our original Constitution was called the 3/5 Compromise, because there was a debate over how do you choose your population to determine representation in the House of Representatives. Well, the South wanted to count all the slaves, and the North said, no, you can't count the slaves because they're not free people. So there again was a compromise that you could count 3/5.
From the Southern point of view, citizens in any state were obliged to return runaway slaves, just as they would be obliged to return stray livestock or stolen cash. But as the nation expanded westward, the boundary between slavery and freedom became harder to enforce. Northern states passed personal liberty laws, guaranteeing jury trials for fugitives and prohibiting state officials from assisting in returning them to the South. Slave owners tried to cut off the problem at the source. Shoes issued to field slaves to prevent foot injuries that could sideline them from work were collected at night to discourage slaves from running away. In several southern states, runaways resisting arrest could be killed with impunity, and the only witness might be the killer himself. Under such conditions, most fugitives never made it very far. Some were mutilated, tendons cut, faces branded, as warnings not to try again, and to others, not to try at all. Still, they kept on trying. Details of how fugitive slaves passed through Wisconsin are sparse, but the earliest escape of which we have record is that of Caroline Quarles, who arrived in Milwaukee in early August 1842 and was hidden by sympathetic allies in that city, Waukesha, and Pewaukee. In late summer, she was conveyed to Racine County and ultimately into Canada. By the 1840s, despite all measures to contain them, the flow of runaways had made the fugitive slave problem, in the words of Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, quote, the gravest and most vital of all questions to us and the whole Union, end quote. So grave that calls for secession arose throughout the South. In response, Congress tried to solve the problem by shifting enforcement responsibility from the states to the federal government.
That's why when you look at the history of Missouri, there was this, it's called Bloody Missouri, because there was literally a bloody, almost civil war in Missouri forecasting what was to come nationally over free or slave. Part of the compromise that came out of that was the fugitive slave law. The North said, if you would go along with this compromise, we will include the fugitive slave law that would allow Southerners to go into the free states and look for, capture, and return runaway slaves, even if they were in free territory.
That obviously was very, very, very controversial in northern states. Now here was the federal government forcing northerners to do something that they thought was wrong. And they didn't like that. So even after the fugitive slave law, in fact, probably more so because of the fugitive slave law, a lot of people in the North not only aided slaves in running away to Canada, the so-called Underground Railroad, but they also aided slaves that had already been arrested by breaking them out of jail. So in that kind of a larger context, it might be easier for us to understand the actions that Sherman Booth took in breaking Joshua Glover out of jail, and more so the actions that many, many people here in Ripon took in aiding Sherman Booth and showing that they did not believe in the fugitive slave law either.
Blake was speaking as part of a 2010 Ripon Historical Society program entitled Booth's War, an event that forever connected Little Ripon to human slavery and brought this growing national issue literally right into the city's downtown streets. Also participating in that presentation was noted Ripon historian George Miller.
First, who was Booth? He was the editor of the Milwaukee Free Democrat, and it was, as he was, violently anti-slavery. And Booth probably was the leading advocate of abolition in the state of Wisconsin.
1852, a slave named Joshua, slaves at that time generally had only their first name, indicating that they had no family or identity, escaped from his owner in Missouri and made his way north and settled in Racine. He worked there for a couple of years, was close to a family named Glover, took on the second name Glover, and finally got a small house. By 1854, his former owner had traced him to Milwaukee and sent federal marshals to arrest him. Under the fugitive slave law, the federal government was was obligated to help Southern owners to recover lost slaves. Marshals were sent to Glover's residence, caught him by surprise, apparently, it is said, beat him, manacled him, and hauled him in a cart down the Milwaukee streets to jail. This outraged the citizens in Milwaukee because it was probably for them the first evidence of what the fugitive slave law was about and what they saw as the huge and inhumane atrocity of what happened to slaves. As a result, a fire-eating editor named Sherman Booth began organizing the idea that Glover should be rescued. In response to this, a group of citizens from Racine came down to Milwaukee and did indeed break into the jail and rescue him and brought Glover back to Racine. He then was hidden in several different areas for over 2 weeks because the ice on Lake Michigan had not yet broken up and it was impossible to get him on a boat to Canada. Once he was put on the boat to Canada, he then made good his escape while the government sought then to arrest Sherman Booth for his agitation and his cooperation and his leading for the escape of Joshua Glover. The rescue of Joshua Glover took place on the 12th of March, 1854, which is 8 days before the meeting in the Little White Schoolhouse. The news of it was all over Wisconsin and excited people about here was the kind of action needed to halt the expansion of slavery. So that the Joshua Glover affair provided a kind of emotional impetus to the movement in Ripon that was already underway. Sherman Booth had been instrumental in gaining the rescue of Joshua Glover, an act for which he was arrested by the U.S. Marshals and sentenced to 30 days in jail as well as a fine. Booth went to jail as a martyr and was quickly accepted as such by virtually everyone. And there was again talk about a release or a rescue. This time the rescue was to be led by people from Ripon. The Ripon contingent was led by two individuals, a faculty professor and his student. The professor was Edward Daniels, a specialist in geology, and his student was Oscar LaGrange.
And they go down to Milwaukee, where Booth is in jail. And LaGrange, who's armed, at the time goes in, holds up the judge, or the guard, and releases Booth. And calmly locks up the guard in Booth's cell. And then they walk down, get in the carriage that's waiting for them, drive out to Daniel's brother-in-law house. And there they make plans for what they're going to do now that they got him out of jail.
They then took him back to Ripon. They were followed by the U.S. Marshals, who came up to re-arrest Booth. They housed themselves at the Mapes House, which is of course, Old Davis Hotel.
We do know that Booth was here in Ripon and that he was giving a speech right downtown in our square.
Booth began to give his speech. The marshals moved in and said, "We're here to arrest you." And the crowd said, "No, you're not," and threw them out bodily. The leading marshal, in fact, tumbled down the stairs.
It's safe to assume that Booth felt safe coming here and that we had very strong abolitionist feelings as a community.
There were efforts then made to rearrest him. He was spirited from one place to another. Efforts were made to arrest LaGrange and Daniels. LaGrange finally was arrested, but was released. Booth was finally arrested, but by then the marshals were just fully tired of the whole thing and gave up. But it is interesting. Ripon, in fact, defied the United States government.
The Booth War is part of a whole series of things happening all over the country in which groups of people, whole sections, whole states of people are saying a law that is legally binding is not morally binding. And people are making that distinction, that you do not have to follow laws. In fact, you should work against laws and break laws that are not morally binding or illegal, that are not moral. And the South feels the same way. When Lincoln says it's not, you don't have the right to secede, they said, who cares? That's just one legal opinion. We got our own legal opinion. Everybody's got their own legal opinion, and ultimately that's why you got the Civil War. Because you cannot have the issue of slavery is so divides people. They're so passionate on it, there ultimately is no compromise on it.
And with that lack of compromise came the collapse of the legitimacy of Congress and the courts as politics became more radically polarized. The leading intellectual of the North, Ralph Waldo Emerson, reacted with horror at the thought that a man who has run the gauntlet of 1,000 miles for his freedom must now, by law, be hunted down and sent back again to the dog hutch he fled from. In 1854, as the crisis over slavery deepened, the Republican Party was founded in Ripon, Wisconsin, to fight for the abolition of human slavery in the United States.
The critical figure in Ripon in forming the Republican Party was a man named Alvin Beauvais. Beauvais was from New York. He came to Ripon in 1850 as a land developer, and was, of course, very much opposed to the extension of slavery into the territories and even to slavery itself.
The meeting in 1854 at the Little White Schoolhouse in Ripon was mainly a concern over the spread of slavery into the new territories. That's why, you know, the members that were there represented most of the different political views. The one thing they all had in common was they did not want the spread of slavery into the new territory. So it was an abolitionist movement, and at that time, to oppose the spread of slavery, to call for the abolition of slavery, was really a radical idea, you know, going all the way back to the beginning of our history.
And because those ideas were so radical, efforts to help runaway slaves had to remain private and very secretive, and for really good reasons.
Well, I think the important factor there is the penalties that anyone could get if he were found to harbor slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act probably did more to help the cause because they had intensified the secrecy of the Underground Railroad. In our times now, trying to research this, we will find cases where people would not tell anybody anything. That's why it's hard to get good evidences of the conduct of the Underground Railroad. It was very hard to get because people wouldn't say a word about it to protect themselves from the possibility of being charged and with these enormous penalties. And they were enormous. That you know, it could take away your old property, all kinds of conditions for that. That led to a much more secret kind of idea of the Underground Railroad.
You know, as far as trying to help the slaves, that was against the law. So people didn't, once again, they didn't want people to know about what they were doing. And so here again, it was a secret society.
A lot of folks are really enamored with the need for some very specific physical evidence. But you got to remember, the Underground Railroad, these people were risking their lives and property by helping these fugitive slaves. So needless to say, stations on the Underground Railroad were kept very secret, sometimes for decades.
Trying to uncover exactly where the Underground Railroad went and to locate stations, as they call them, along the way, is very, very difficult. It was a secret group. They knew they were breaking the federal fugitive slave law. They realized they could be imprisoned for doing this.
One of the reasons why there was anti-slavery feeling in Wisconsin is because an awful lot of the settlers had come from the Northeast, where there had been anti-slavery feeling for quite some time.
And Steinbring believes those feelings Ripon's early settlers brought with them from the Northeast lends credibility that the Ceresco phalanx could very well have played a role in the Underground Railroad.
Ceresco is important for research on the Underground Railroad, and this is probably something that most people have not really given any time to, but the condition of the phalanx as a closed community. This enables the whole of the phalanx organizationally to close off any kind of interference in projects or interests that would do something to the secrecy of the phalanx. And so I believe that the whole of the Ceresco phalanx functioned as a station in the Underground Railroad. And there's evidence that this may well have been. In the records of the Wisconsin phalanx, which it is called, there are instances of bringing something in wagons from southern locations. And these somethings, I think, were slaves that had escaped and were being dealt with by the Underground Railroad. It's an easy thing for a community like this, which is closed. I mean, the records of the Wisconsin phalanx have instances where they rejected the application of people that wanted to become members of it. So this is an evidence of how tight the phalanx actually was. And it would lend itself, this condition, to running a station on the Underground Railroad. I do believe that that's exactly what they did, and that the whole of the organization and the location of it and the attitudes of the phalanx members, who were all ardent abolitionists. And this is expressed in many ways, including letters from people outside the phalanx. The person that is most usually identified in connection with the Underground Railroad is somebody by the name of M.E. Morse. In the Pedrick papers, you will find an instance where a modern, let's say a descendant of M.E. Morse, also called M.E. Morse, actually says that his father was the conductor of the Underground Railroad in the phalanx. This isn't evidence that it actually existed, because people could make up stuff like that. But I think it's a pretty good bet, because there are other things that help in identifying the phalanx as a station in the Underground Railroad. One of the things is that in the records of the community, the written records, there are cases where there are long-distance travels with wagons to acquire something in cities along the Lake Michigan shore. And there are instances where acquiring something may well have meant that they were getting slaves escaped and bringing them to safety in the phalanx, and then, of course, helping to get them on the route that would take them ultimately to Canada.
The house that Steinbrink currently lives in is located at 610 Liberty Street in Ripon, in the area known as Ceresco. It was one of 4 buildings in the Ceresco community that were built in an 8-sided formation. There were 2 octagon houses on Liberty Street, 1 on State Street, and an octagon school on Park Street. In a letter to the Ripon Historical Society dated January 4th, 1964, Lyda Stone Matt notes that her grandparents were living in the octagon house on State Street. There was only one room upstairs, which was my mother's, and she was about 10 years old, but the sloping eaves surrounded that room, and she recalls a dark night when a man brought a darky to be hidden overnight, and they secreted him under the eaves, and she slept in the little upper bedroom, and people came to search the house, but he wasn't found at all. Steinbring says there were approximately 30 octagon structures built in Wisconsin during the 1850s, right during the height of the Underground Railroad. Many people believe, including Steinbring, that there is a direct connection between octagonal structures and the various routes on the Underground Railroad.
I've come to the conclusion that the presence of octagonal architecture on a route from northern Illinois would bring you into this area. I suspect that there was more to it in Ripon and Ceresco than we now know about. I think it's more than coincidence that the octagonal dwellings of the 1850s were on routes or locations that were consistent with the maneuvers of the Underground Railroad. They are prominent, they're different, and they attract attention.
Steinbring's house was built in 1850 by Jacob Woodruff.
Woodruff was an abolitionist, and he built an octagon house consistent with other abolitionists on routes that were consistent with the movements of the Underground Railroad. So anyway, Woodruff may have, I can't prove this, but he may have harbored escaped slaves in the Octagon House on Liberty Street in Ripon. There are certain architectural features that make me suspicious that that did happen. One of them is an entry into the basement on the north side of the house. We found this out when we had to demolish the north part of the house. This happened in 1990. There was no basement in the north half of the house. It was an extension of the octagon that was built in 1870. I guess Woodruff's family was expanding. He didn't have enough room in the simple octagon that he had built in 1850. So when we demolished it, we had opportunity to do kind of an archaeological investigation of the footings and all this. And one thing we did find that would be consistent with Underground Railroad and secret entries and stuff like that was a brick blocked up entry at ground level on the north segment of the octagon. This had no function, no visible function, but it communicated, the entry communicated with a large brick cistern. When you find cisterns that they were abandoned, they were much like the privies. You threw all your garbage in, all kinds of empty bottles, which are numerous in those days, and this did not happen. In this case, the cistern was completely free of everything. It was just a nice big, well, 8 foot, like a room, like an empty space.
The Steinbring residence is not the only location in Ripon where an underground hole has been discovered. Don Hacker and his family moved to Ripon in the mid-1990s, and in 2016, they had to replace their driveway at their home on Thorn Street.
We had a situation with our driveway where we had a deep depression that just suddenly occurred underneath our driveway. And it was quite deep. It was 4 feet deep. under there, and they came in with a giant hydro hoe and they probed around, and they really couldn't get through what was down there. It seemed like a solid layer of something, but there's something caused a 4-foot deep depression to occur under a slab that was 8 inches thick.
Just a year later, in 2017, Hacker witnessed another, much more significant event in his neighborhood.
In addition to the small hole, relatively speaking, I mean, it was a big hole to us because we had to put in a new driveway because of it. There was another hole that developed in our neighborhood that had a little bit more of an interesting appearance. This hole started out as something about roughly the size of a pie plate, and it kept getting progressively larger until finally the whole structure that was covering it caved in. And under about 3 feet of dirt, there were real thick wooden planks, and they covered what looked like a dry cistern, but it didn't look like any cistern I've ever seen. Now, I grew up with in the water well drilling business, and I'd seen a lot of water cisterns, and I'd seen a lot of sewage cisterns that were built as dry wells before they had regular septic systems and city sewers and city water. And this was like nothing I'd ever seen. First off, it was built of stone that looks a lot like the limestone that they've built numerous houses out of in Ripon. It's not the kind of material you'd normally build a cistern out of. Second, it really wasn't bottlenecked. Normally a cistern will come up and it will taper so that there's an opening at the top through which they would draw most of the water. The main reason for that was to keep groundwater out of it, because they were capturing the water from their roofs and other things through going through a filtration system and then storing it in the cistern. But this looked like dry stone work. So in other words, there was no obvious mortar, telling me that, first off, it's been there a long time. Second off, it's not built like a normal cistern, and it's only 3 feet below the ground, and the opening is covered by thick boards. So it seemed to me that only 3 feet below the ground, covered by thick boards, what if there was a fake well on top? And this was a hidey hole, someplace where fugitive slaves might be able to spend a night or a day or two out of the weather and hard to find. It was also quite a bit larger than the normal cistern. Normally a cistern, generally, if you think of something about 500 gallons, so we're talking something that's roughly 4 feet by 4 feet by 6 feet or so, if you think of a 500-gallon tank. This was enormous. It was probably 10 feet across, and it was probably all of 8 feet deep from the top of where the boards used to be. So it was literally the size of a room. And there was a large pipe that had been cemented off, but it was a clay tile that was all of 12 inches in diameter. Now that's a lot bigger than what would normally be used either to carry water or to carry sewage, because it simply didn't need a pipe that large. So was this ventilation instead of perhaps a conduit for effluent or for water. And another thing was there was no evidence of any dirt. There was no evidence of any water having ever been in it. Normally, if you'd filled it with sewage, you would expect to find some, black dirt associated with the degraded materials that tend to be deposited there. There was none of that. The only thing that was in the bottom of this hole were the boards and the soil that was on top of the boards. And to me, seeing it's in my neighborhood, we've got the Catlin House. Southwoods is over there. There's an oral tradition from pretty much everybody you talk to that there's the Underground Railroad here in Ripon. Maybe, just maybe, someday they'll dig that thing back up and find out what it really was.
The Catlin residence that Hacker refers to is located at 512 Woodside Avenue, just around the corner from Hacker's. Steve and Kathy Lee Arbaugh purchased the home in 2015, and in 2017, Steve gave a presentation on the history of the home at the Ripon Historical Society. The historic home was built by Richard Catlin in the late 1850s and was part of a 38-acre estate, complete with a servant quarters and a horse barn. Like many early Ripon settlers, the Catlins came from out east, and the family was very abolitionist-minded. Richard's brother James was on numerous committees with American statesman Frederick Douglass, who, after escaping slavery in Maryland, became a national leader in the abolitionist movement. James Catlin also published his own abolitionist newspaper entitled True American. On April 7, 1857, Richard Catlin's sister-in-law, Cynthia Catlin Miller, quote, opened her home to a fugitive slave who was 33 days into his third attempt to escape to Canada. This, according to cemetery records from Sugar Grove, Pennsylvania, one of the country's most well-traveled Underground Railroad strongholds.
There are some things that I've observed personally. Not only are we near the Catlin House, we're backdoor neighbors with the Catlin House, and you can see that cupola practically all over town. In fact, one of the things that the previous owners used to do in the Christmas season is they put a Christmas tree up there and they left it on year-round. I can't only but imagine what a single candle in that cupola might have looked like in the middle 1800s when that house was built, when there were no streetlights, when when it was very dark. You could probably see that for miles away. You could certainly see it from the railroad or from any of the church steeples that existed in town if somebody was coming through here at night, which, as everybody who's done any looking at the Underground Railroad knows, that was when most of the people traveled.
Now, there are things that people have told stories about or have heard about, such as quilts hanging in windows. These quilts may have hung up there, and with Native American or with Negroes not being able to read, they could see a quilt. Or the idea of an octagon building, that could be another thing that led them to this area. Or even the fact that a house had a cupola on top. If it had a cupola on top, that may have been a sign that that was a house that could take care of slaves.
Many of the octagons had cupolas, and they were all capable of signaling to escaped slaves who were using all of the river systems, not just the Rock River, but all of them. And of course, they traveled by night almost exclusively, and they would see these signals in the turrets on the top of these dwellings.
Here's an example of a cupola on the top of this building. There's a cupola on top of this building. This building was the Republican House restaurant. And that cupola may have been where, if they saw that, they might have trusted that house to go to. Here's another cupola on top of this building, but that looks more like a garage. So with cupolas such as those may have been a recognizable thing that they would look for. And whether or not slaves hid up in there, we don't know, but that's the way the story goes once again. This picture was taken from East Hall on the cupola, on top of East Hall. But East Hall and Ripon, we have lots of bird's eye pictures. This one was from 1880 or earlier. This steeple is this is now the American Legion building. This American Legion building was once a Baptist church, and the steeple on top could have been a cupola. Or the bell tower in the school, that could have been but this school was built in the 1870s, so that wasn't there at the time.
So, is that a feature of the Underground Railroad? Well, I don't know, but somebody who's been a lifelong resident here, whose father was a lifelong resident before him, once told me that the Catlin estate had a direct line of some kind, whether it was above ground or below ground, he didn't know, to the South Woods area where another station on the Underground Railroad existed.
Ripon's South Woods, because of its various formations and caves, has long been rumored to have been a possible location where runaway slaves could have been hidden.
There are even stories that some of the slaves hid in South Woods because there are caves in there, the limestone caves that may have come up. But even, buildings, some people just think because it was called underground, they hid underground.
People would come up and just tell me, well, do you know about this place? When I was still teaching. There was a tunnel out there that some people think might have been a place. And that's all I know about it.
the folklore was that there was a cave that went down to Silver Creek, and there was another cave that went out to South Woods, which would lead you to believe that it's a pretty elaborate system.
T-Bond came to Ripon in 1992, and less than a decade later, he was part of a group that did some digging, literally, underneath one of the city's most famous buildings, at least when it comes to the legend of the Underground Railroad possibly running through Ripon.
Almost from day one, when I took the job, there were a lot of people that were talking about the folklore that surrounded Ripon, with Ripon being a part of the Underground Railroad. And one of the locations that they used to talk about was the old Breadbasket Bakery, and that was one of the entrances to the underground cave system. So it wasn't until a fire destroyed the bakery in, it must have been '99, something like that, that we worked out an arrangement with the owners to have Main Street purchase the building. And at that point, we started to do some exploration in the basement, and lo and behold, we found a cavity below the concrete floor. So networked with the Wisconsin Speleological Society, and they came in and did some exploration, and we found something. You know, what that is still to be determined, because we never did finish the exploration.
They did find a pit below the bakery. Many people, again, guess this could have been a place they hid slaves. And yes, it could have been. But you go further back, and that building was originally, I believe, a butcher shop. And the tunnel that went from the pit down towards Silver Creek, which again lends to the speculation, place to hide them, place to get out, place to sneak in, and all that stuff without people seeing you. Now the story started going again.
Folklore had it that there was a domed room underneath the downtown that was large enough to turn a team of horses around. So is that a 17-foot room? Is that a 25-foot room? That was one of the things that was never explained. That was just what some of the old timers had shared with a gentleman named Carl Siebert, who is involved with this Wisconsin Speleological Society. So we did not find that room. This shaft that we found, that we uncovered, has a dolomite cliff on one side with laid up stone on the other side. So it's a man-made feature adjacent to a natural feature. And then when you go down into this area, there were pockets that went back another distance, but we never finished that part of exploration.
You see the trough. Mm-hmm. So the trough now is about dug down to about 2-3 feet, but we've been taking a rake and bringing the tailings down from let's call the cathedral room, the next room in.
Okay.
And then we'll do that in one stage, because we're still fairly low there. It's hard to move buckets back and forth at this point.
Okay.
Then we stand here and we'll rake from underneath that keyhole feature, rake it out into here. Of course, we have to pump the water out first before we get to that point.
Right.
But we're about at the point now that inside the cathedral room we could stand and fill buckets.
Cool.
All right, so...
And this is that other feature?
This is the
cylinder.
5-inch hole. It's been tested to 8 feet deep. It seems to... Here, let's see water out. We've probed it to 8 feet. Certainly these honeycomb features are extremely interesting. They're a little muddy. We'll wash them up and they'll be a lot prettier. We think that... I'm not really sure about the nature of the honeycomb formations. The ledge over here we know goes to about 6-7 feet in, indicating that there's a good deal more cave probably on room on this eastern side of the brick wall. But
so the exploration of this depression under the basement floor took a few weeks to actually dig out, because they had to dig out roughly 17 feet of debris down to to the bottom area, and that required digging by hand with 5-gallon pails and raising everything up with a pulley system to the top of the basement, and then starting the whole process over again. So it over a period of several weeks, we got down to this shelf type area where we found something. We found there was a dolomite shelf. There was a man-made cylinder in the shelf, and then below this crevice in that dolomite shelf, we put probe rods down, and there was another 8 feet of diggable debris. But there was water that was building up inside of that opening. Groundwater is roughly 54 degrees, which the onset of hypothermia can happen actually quickly in that kind of environment. So it was something that we just couldn't continue the way we were. And but during that period, we were able to pump enough water out just to keep the process going for a little bit longer. And yeah, I was one of the persons that was able to repel roughly that 17 feet down into the hole. And they showed me some of those formations. They weren't, I think they called it float stone, a couple different terms that they used. And there's definitely formations, but it just, is it the Underground Railroad? That part we never were able to prove or disprove. But there is something there that does fit with folklore.
And if you can see they're not stalactites,
Yep.
but they're stalactite-like formations. They're cut by flowing water.
Sure.
Actually quite pretty. See the one back here by the light?
Right there?
Yeah.
I believe so. Yeah.
And now, let's see if you can see where I'm sticking this probe.
Yep.
We believe it goes at least about 14, 15 feet in there, and that's where the biggest amount of water is coming through.
Okay.
This time we've been seeing dirt falling down and coming with the water. So, and this is pretty much, I would say, it's southbound.
Okay.
Southbound hole at this point. It's not very well lit, but it looks like we can see in there about 14, 15 feet. True, it is narrowing here, but then this slab is tapering down. So if the taper stays with it, then it certainly is crawlable
Okay.
from this point forward. Just as you head in, you'll see a triangular or pyramidal tooth of rock. That's
Okay.
no, we're fine.
Cool.
Can you see anything?
Yeah.
Good.
Well, sort of.
No,
Okay. And then I'm trying to get stuck on here.
oh, okay.
Huh.
So yeah, if you look at the height of the ceilings, it's almost as if it's almost all the way back up the top.
Yeah.
I mean, they're high.
Oh, sure.
That guy there, we're kind of calling the duck.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, the top part of the bill is loose, completely loose piece of rock.
Okay.
So wiggle that back into place.
Yeah, it's kind of close. I don't know if it's really seeing it.
Our hope was that we would be able to find somebody who could help us take the search to the next level. So we would need some sort of vacuum type equipment to actually suck the water out, suck the debris out, and find out what's below that 8 feet that we didn't get a chance to dig out, or what's in some of these other spots that appears to be some sort of crevice, but we don't know whether it's just a 2-foot crevice that you couldn't get into, or is it a larger thing? Is that the dome underneath the building? We didn't find that out. Aside from being able to remove more debris from this underground opening and determining whether it's a cave, determining whether is there anything there that would lead you to believe that there were fugitive slaves hidden in the cave. Without funds, without more research, we don't know. During this period, we had numerous conversations with George Miller, noted Ripon College history professor, member of the Ripon Historic Society, as well as Frank Farver, and each of those had differing opinions, as well as I remember chatting with Olive Blake. Her family used to own the bakery going back into I believe the 60s and 50s and maybe even the 40s. So there were a number of people who came forward and just shared little tidbits of information from their past, because this was probably their fathers or grandfathers that would have shared that information with them, grandmothers or so. But yeah, so there's a number of people that all had differing opinions, and all those opinions were based off of different reasoning.
One such individual who knew something about the bakery building's basement actually came forward 50 years prior to the 2001 dig, when he told his story to members of the Ripon Historical Society on July 10th, 1961.
Well, I used to work for Otto Miller here in Ripon and the meat market, and of course I was a young fellow, and another fellow named Howard Rake. He used to live on Houston Street. And we always had to take his rubbish that we were at in the butcher shop and dump it down in this hole. The hole was probably about as big as this table, the opening was. And I said to Otto Miller, I says, what is that hole there for? And well, he says the horse thieves used to come down and steal horses, and they'd hide them down there. And I said, God, ever got a horse down there? I said, never get him out. And so I and Rake one Sunday, they kept open Sundays till noon, till after church in the meat market. And so about 11 o'clock, I said, I'd like to go down in that thing, and Alpha Rake did too. And so Otto Miller says, well, you want to go down there? He said, you take a lantern along, and he said, if you go up so far and if that lantern goes out, there's no more air, then you fellas come back. So we did. We went up, I think, way up here under the college up there somewhere, and we got a little scared. We was only about 16, 17 years old. We come back. He said, if I'm locked up, he said, you can come out by the depot there. And it's a very narrow place. Of course, I wasn't as heavy as I was now. I couldn't have got out there. And they had them old church fashioned keys, you know, they like a jackknife, and they closed them on the outside. You could never get out. If you was in, you couldn't get out.
You got out down there as you came out? Do I understand that?
What is that?
You got out, you came out?
By the depot.
Way down the depot?
Yeah, that's where the opening was. It was a long slap in there.
And you went in back of where your shop was there, the automotive shop, eh?
Yeah. And, no, Northwestern. But when they built that cement road, they put buttons out, you know, and they closed that hole up. And it's all shelving in there. The small shelves are on top, but I suppose that's soft limestone is probably millions of years. It's washed in there, and that's softer. And as they come down, the bigger they get. And when they get down to the bottom, there's a spring in here. But in the spring of the year, that thing was full of water that used to come down through by Frank Pischke's there, underground, you know, and wash all the stuff out of there. There's quite a few of them know about it. There ain't many of them left there anymore. Hank Leitz was one of them that knew about it. And this Rake, he got killed in the First World War. He was with us in the First World War. And Bill Leitz knew about it, and Andrew Dorsch, all them fellows knew about this place. And it's all shelving in there. In the summertime, when it didn't rain much, well, then there was just a regular spring, about like Southwood Springs. That's about all the water comes through there. When the spring of the year, there was a lot of it.
You made only that one trip into it?
That's the only trip we made. And they dumped rubbish in there. We still dumped rubbish in when I went in there in 1920. And Mr. Hunter Schultz, Dad, he cemented it. The state come in and told me that was a butcher shop. He had to cement the basement. They wasn't cemented, see.
How far did you go up the other way?
Oh, we went up, way up under the college here, past the college here.
And how much further did it go?
Huh?
How much further did it go? You didn't know.
Oh, I don't know how far it went. It got smaller as you went up. The biggest part was going up. You know, it was as wide as this room. higher in this room too.
Had it been dug or was it?
No, it was a washout. It's been there for millions and billions of years probably, underground.
When you spoke of the Pischke place, you mean south?
It's right between Frank Pischke's, the washout's there. The opening used to be there, but they got a, what do you call it there now, closed up so kids couldn't fall in there, you know.
I think there was a slough hole out there.
Yeah, a slough hole.
Oh, is that, what street is it near? South Grove?
Southeast Grove and Woodside.
Woodside.
Yeah. It's between Frank Pischke's and Louis Fiber, just kitty cross.
Did anyone here ever read anything about when they were passing slaves up from the south? I've read somewhere that around in the Ripon vicinity, they would harbor these slaves.
Well, they never had no slaves in here.
They would hide them in caves around in the Ripon vicinity. Has anyone ever read anything about that?
Yes, lots of stuff about that. It's all bogus. I say lots of stuff about that, that's all bogus.
Yeah.
So, much like that unanswered question from the 1961 audio recording and the inconclusive results of T-Bon's 2001 dig at the Old Bakery, lots of speculation still remains about Ripon's role in the Underground Railroad. And the most recent dig that could have connected the two definitely did not answer all the questions either. In the fall of 2015, an archaeological team led by Paul Reckner from the Wisconsin State Historical Society began searching along Highway 44, just west of Pickett, about 6 miles northeast of Ripon. They started off looking for an old blacksmith shop from the mid-1800s that was operated by James Sanders.
So this is our guy. This is James Sanders. His obituary published in 1904, and this is what the obituary editor for the Marquette Tribune was kind of moved to observe about Sanders in passing. So being a man of large sympathy, he was always found fighting on the side of the common people. And I think that's kind of beautiful. You know, that captures the kind of the personhood of this really remarkably civically engaged individual who was willing to go to like great lengths for what he felt was morally correct.
The most recent dig out there at Sanders blacksmith shop, which is on the bend on your way to from Ripon to Pickett. I'm not cognizant of all the exact findings that were made, but I don't think they found proof that there were slaves hidden there. But it would make sense that that could be a possibility because, again, you have to, when you take a look at, if you could prove one place where there was a slave, okay, now you can make a pretty good estimate. Okay, if I'm a runaway slave and I got 5-6 hours under the cover of darkness to get from point A to point B, how far could point B be from point A? Well, at that time in history, even 16 miles a day was considered good on horseback. So if 16 miles a day was good on horseback, what could you do on foot? Well, not quite that much. So now you start looking at, could they chunk off, 6 miles, 8 miles, 10 miles, well, now you start going, well, from here to where Sanders blacksmith was, that's an easy make in a day. And then from the blacksmith to Jasper Pickett's house, that's an easy make. And then up to Oshkosh, and yeah, that's doable. And then you could get on board and go up the Fox River. Yeah, and so all that stuff, you start making those estimates, and it makes it possible. And being possible maybe even makes it probable But is it fact? There again, your guess is as good as mine.
Well, what we're doing is we're doing some ongoing research, and this is kind of one of those other stay tuned things. We're trying to locate any reported or documented sites related to the Underground Railroad in the Waupun area, western Fond du Lac County, into Brown County, Winnebago and Brown. We're pondering the idea that there may have been a corridor here that allowed people to move overland across Wisconsin, maybe coming out of Missouri, through Wisconsin, and then up to Green Bay, to the port at Green Bay, because there are really good documented episodes or events where escaped slaves were held or protected by families in Green Bay who had connections to ship's captains who were also sympathetic. And the families would arrange for these captains as they came into port to take on these escaping slaves. And then, the ship would just happen to dock in a Canadian port at some point, and, and they were free. So that would be a neat connection to make if we can. But like I said, stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned, indeed.
There comes a point in time where, when physical evidence isn't observable, reasonable people look at the oral history and the anecdotal evidence. Every major archaeological find that's ever taken place in the Middle East wasn't because somebody looked up in a book somewhere and saw a picture of where the city of Thebes was in Egypt, for example. They just simply they just listened to the people in the area, and then they started digging. In fact, one of the major archaeological finds over there was because some guy said, well, what if the river didn't always run right here? And that's how they discovered the city of Thebes over in Egypt, was the guy started looking for features in the landscape that looked like a river might have been there once, and they started digging up all these Egyptian tombs. So here we've got Little Ripon in the middle of Wisconsin with a rich tradition of a anti-slavery sort of sentiment within all the communities that initially started there. A lot of architectural features that are associated with stops on the Underground Railroad, and a rich oral tradition that the Underground Railroad used to run through here. And to me, we may not have the same kind of evidence they've discovered in Milton, down there at the Milton House, but who's to say we won't? But the truth be known, if I had to bet the farm, so to speak, I'd say, there's a lot more to say the Underground Railroad may have been here than there is to say the Underground Railroad hasn't been here, this side of physical evidence.
Well, I think there's a good evidence that the Underground Railroad functioned in the Ceresco component of the Ripon community.
You can talk about it, come up with this idea, that idea, and you can't really prove anybody wrong, but you can't really prove that anybody right.
It's difficult for me to actually, with certainty, say that was the Underground Railroad. Certainly parts of folklore do tie in with what has been found in that basement area. But there were other parts of folklore that talked about this underground cave being used for bootlegging and illegal gambling and things of that nature during Prohibition. So I think that likelihood is probably greater than the likelihood of the Underground Railroad.
In my opinion, the Underground Railroad going through Ripon, I feel like there's a very strong possibility of it, just because of some of the stories that go out. But we don't know for sure, but I believe that Ripon has always been a very forward community. And right from its start, it probably, said, no more slavery.
Just the idea that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen, and that is not an oral tradition, that's a biblical principle. And I really think that when it comes to an operating principle of life, that a little bit of faith is a good thing. And if it takes a little bit of faith to believe that the Underground Railroad was here because there's such a rich tradition in this town, I don't think that faith is misplaced. I think that in some ways, just simply keeping the idea the Underground Railroad may have been here alive will cause a top-of-mind awareness so that people start looking for things that the Underground might represent the presence of the Underground Railroad.
Thank you.